like I said, I give it a thumbs in the middle.
No.
Hey everybody, Deathblade here. My name's Jeremy and I am a translator of Chinese fantasy novels. I'm doing a review of this book here, which is The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water by Zen Cho. And there you go, I'll put it up so you can see it. This is billed as a Wuxia inspired tale of banditry, faith, and changes both of the world and of the self. And when I saw Wuxia as the inspiration and also saw a lot of people talking about it on Twitter, I decided to get it and check it out, see what I think. So here's my review. Now I'm gonna right up front give you my just overall opinion. I'm gonna say that if I had to use a thumbs up and thumbs down, I would probably go thumbs in the middle for this one. The reason being that I think some people will really like it, but it's probably not for everyone. I, generally speaking, enjoyed it. It was a good read, it was pretty fast, and the writing was put together pretty well with some exceptions. There are a few things that I actually really didn't like about it, which I'm gonna get into that later. I'm gonna start out with the things that I do like. Now, for one thing, just the cover itself is actually awesome. It's a really beautiful cover. You can see there's a lot going on. There's a guy with some kind of weapon, a saber most likely, and then over here there is a Buddhist nun. So I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be referring to kind of the two main characters that emerge in the course of the narrative. It's not a novel, it's very short as you can see. I'm pretty sure even on Amazon they're calling it a novelette. And I do want to emphasize that it is Wuxia inspired, it is not Wuxia. That said, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding from the get-go about the level of Wuxia, which I'll get to when I talk about my criticism of the book. So continuing with the things that I like, the book is kind of quasi-historical. It takes place in the Malayan emergency time period, which is something I actually didn't know anything about before picking up the book. And I really do like it when books take you back to certain periods of time. Now I understand it's not supposed to be historical fiction, but truth be told, some of the most famous Wuxia books in existence, those written by Zen Cho, are very similar. They have characters who are engaging in adventures that take place in a specific time period, sometimes even interacting with real historical figures. And this is that kind of story, so I do really like that. I learned something because of picking up this novel, thought it was cool. I think the writing is, for the most part, very well done. It reads well. It's very fast-paced. The action goes at a good clip, and there are some interesting characters in the novel. And so those are the things that I like about it. Now, getting into things that I take issue with, one of them is the fact that it takes place in the Malayan emergency. Now, not that I don't like that aspect, but basically you have no way of knowing that. Like, there's nothing in the novel that would tell you that unless you are very familiar with the history of Malaysia. But for people who are not familiar with that history, there's no way to know. The only reason I figured it out was because I went online and went onto the author's Twitter and kind of started poking around and doing my own research, and finally I realized, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. There are no dates, there's no explanations in the beginning parts of the book. There's just, you're thrown kind of into the middle of a scene, a quasi-action scene, and it's kind of left to you to figure it all out. Now, it would be one thing if this was a book directed at Malaysian audiences. For example, the books I mentioned before by Zen Cho, they're written for Chinese audiences. Zen Cho probably didn't need to go into a lot of detail explaining the historical aspects because the audience would, generally speaking, be familiar with that. But this is published by Tor and Tom Doherty Press, so it's obviously not directed at Malaysian market, it's directed at the Western market, and yet the audience, the readers, are left to just kind of figure out what the setting is. I didn't like that. Another thing that I didn't like is that there's a lot of non-English stuff thrown in there. Now, in general, I think that could work well. The characters are supposed to be using the terminology that's common at the time in Malaysia, which I think it could be cool, but the problem is there's no explanation. There's a lot of stuff thrown out there that you're supposed to either pick up from context, or sometimes there actually is no context. There's literally no way to understand what these non-English words mean, and it doesn't add to the experience to have words in there that you don't understand. And that was really confusing. Now, lucky for me, I have a Malaysian friend, one of the translators at Wuxia World, which is where I do most of my work translating. He's from Malaysia, and so basically after the first chapter or so, I messaged him on Discord and was like, hey, I need some help here. And the funny thing was, there were even some terms that he didn't 100% understand until I gave him sort of larger context, and then he was able to tell me what some of these things meant, and of course you can Google it. That's fine. I don't have any problem with non-English words being in the story. It's kind of frustrating when you don't understand what it's talking about. The main example from the first chapter is there's the word mata, which there's no explanation at the beginning. You kind of guess what it means, and then it becomes more clear as you go through the story that it's being used to be the police. But even at this point, I don't really know what it means. Is it the military police? Is it the like provincial police? Are they just, thugs enforcing laws for local warlords? I really don't know. It never completely explained it. And so there's a lot of stuff like that that made the story kind of bog down for me when I just didn't understand what was being talked about. The third main thing that I had a problem with was that a lot of the story seemed extremely contrived to me. Now, I usually don't like it when people complain that stories are contrived. My main argument when people say that is I say, well, it's fiction, so of course it's inherently contrived by the imagination of the author. So I usually don't like when people complain about things being contrived, but in this story, I just really had a hard time getting into what was happening because to me it didn't make sense. The perfect example is the first chapter. You have a scene that after you get deeper into the novel and realize the context of the story and the group of people that are involved, you go back and think about what happened in the first chapter and you're like, wait a second. Why did that even happen that way? It doesn't really make much sense. And then over and over again throughout the story, random things will happen where it doesn't seem to make logical sense, but it needs to happen to drive the plot along. And so for me, that kind of pulled me out of the story. Instead of being immersed in what was happening and can't wait to see what's happening next, I was kind of confused, being like, wait a second, why did that just happen? Another thing that I took issue with were the characters. Now there are a couple characters that did stand out, but there's actually a larger cast of characters that are literally nothing but cardboard cutouts kind of in the background to throw in a bit of dialogue here or there. And the naming convention is really weird. Sometimes personalized names are used, sometimes full names, and there's no explanation about why that happens, to the point where at one point I thought there were two different characters that were actually the same character. Another point, I think I was 3 or 4 chapters in, it mentions a person that I had never heard before that I could remember, but was apparently a part of the group. And so I was a little bit confused by that. In the end, there is a story that's going on between 2 of the characters, and it is a pretty interesting story. It's cool, but overall, I was not particularly impressed by how all the different characters were portrayed. Now, I don't want to get into spoilers here. It's a very short story, so I don't want to reveal what happens. Essentially, you have a Buddhist nun who hooks up with a group of bandits, and this group of bandits is on a mission to do something. She kind of just tags along, but then kind of gets mixed up in what they're doing, and then a larger plot unfolds, and they have to expand what they're doing. Again, I don't want to get too much into the details because I'll spoil it for everybody. It was kind of a cool story, but I didn't feel immersed in what I felt was an actual story. For example, now maybe there's cultural implications here that I don't understand. I'm not an expert on Malaysian culture. I think this goes back to what I was saying about the history and the language. If there are these cultural things that are obvious to people who are part of Malaysian culture, but not to other people, I think they should be explained, especially for a novel or a novelette that's targeting audiences that aren't familiar with the culture. But for example, in the opening chapter, you have a Buddhist nun who is working as a waitress at a coffee shop. And I found that weird. I mean, is that a common thing in that period of time in Malaysia? I don't know. I wasn't sure why that would be happening. I didn't think it was common for monks and nuns to be getting jobs at coffee shops. I think it has something to do with the Malayan emergency situation and her status as kind of like a wanderer whose temple was destroyed. But it never really stated that clearly, especially in the opening chapter. Final thing I want to say is about the wuxia side. So as you may or may not know, depending on if you're a fan of my channel, I specialize in Chinese fantasy genres, so xianxia, wuxia, xianghuan, and I know a lot about them. I don't claim to be an expert in them, but I've read a lot of that content, watched a lot of movies and TV shows, and I've translated a huge amount of that type of fiction. And for me personally, I really don't see why this is wuxia inspired. I personally think that that was picked as a marketing gimmick because right now wuxia is kind of trending a little bit in popular culture in the West, and I feel like that was picked to kind of push the novel and try to make it seem like something I personally think it wasn't. I really don't see what's wuxia about it. Now, I did a video recently about when specifically Westerners write wuxia and xianxia novels. I'll link to that right here. Obviously, this wasn't written by a Westerner per se, but I do feel like some of the similar things apply. Essentially, there are parts of this book and the characters and the action and the setting and stuff that are slightly reminiscent of wuxia, but that doesn't mean it's inspired by it. Like, just because the story has some things that wuxia also has doesn't make it wuxia. Now granted, it does say wuxia inspired, it does not say this is a wuxia story, so there's always going to be that to fall back on. Anybody's going to be able to say, well, they didn't say it was wuxia, they said it was wuxia inspired. But even so, I don't see what's inspired by wuxia. I'm sure the author has a take on that, and maybe she could provide more details about that. But again, I feel like if you're gonna have a key element of your story that has to be figured out by going onto Twitter or to some website to read other explanations, it's kind of missing the mark. In terms of the setting, it's not China, it's Malaysia. A lot of the characters are Chinese, that's cool. They have weapons, they do hand-to-hand combat and whatnot. There's kind of like a underworld, outside of society element, I guess, but maybe that was the inspiration. In terms of the action, there's very little. There's a fight scene in the chapter 1 that's basically comes across as being like a barroom brawl, except it's in a coffee house. Then in the middle of the story, there is another action scene, but again, it comes across as almost being just kind of like chaotic fighting. Then in the very last chapter, or maybe it's the second to last chapter, I can't remember, there is a fight scene that does have some stuff that you might expect to see in Wuxia. So that part was kind of cool, but just because there's like one scene that kind of seems Wuxia-esque, I don't know if that's enough to say that it's a Wuxia-inspired story. So I recently did another video about Star Wars. It's talking about why Star Wars isn't Wuxia, and then in that video I list some key things that I think Wuxia stories have to have, and for the most part, I feel like this story doesn't have those. So again, going back to my point, it's definitely not Wuxia, and I think it's questionable whether it's Wuxia inspired, but I think this is a problem because going onto Twitter and seeing what people are saying about it, I have seen multiple people who say, well, I've never read a Wuxia story, but I'm picking this up because I'm interested. No, if you want to find out what Wuxia is like, this is not the book to start out with. So in the end, if you are interested in historical stuff, Malaysian stuff, some kind of fast-paced, interesting story, there are some plot elements that I'm not going to get into because it would be totally spoilers that are pretty important to the plot, but again, I'm not going to get into it. It has twists and turns, it has some big reveal moments, it does have a little bit of action, like I said, and again, there's that final fight scene where there's some really cool stuff that happens. Overall, I like the way it ended. I thought it was a cool ending. If you're branching out and looking for interesting stuff to read that's not Chinese fantasy stuff related, if you're part of my audience, or you're just interested in a good story, check it out. I will have a link in the description below. That's it for this video. I'll see you next time. Gao